The Prime Minister's been out and about. Very interesting. It's the pre-campaign campaign is what I'd call it. Prime Minister was in the Hunter. Let's get some analysis of that and more. National Editor of the Australian newspaper, Dennis Shanahan, joins me now from Canberra. OK, Dennis, we're really into sort of the pre-business end of the parliamentary term. They're very keen, the coalition, on those 3 seats in the Hunter. The Hunter seat, of course, Joel Fitzgibbon's retiring there. Patterson and Shortland, our 2 Labor incumbents, hold them. They are running again. I have to say it's a harder sell post Glasgow. Previously, you know, the government was able to say there's a lot of difference between us and Labor on coal and climate change. Now there's not a lot of difference, at least on the 2050 target. How do you think that's going to go for the PM, and how did he go today, did you think?
Well, look, I think it's as soon as we saw the high-vis vests and the hard hat, we knew that, you know, there's an election round the corner. We'll see a lot of that. And effectively, we're into an election campaign now. Everyone knows it has to be by May next year. So we'll just be in campaign mode effectively for the next few months. Whether it's April or May, it's immaterial, really. But I think that the Prime Minister's job in the Hunter particularly is a bit harder because the government has now committed to a net zero emissions policy by 2050. Not that this will be able to be worked on by Labor, but it'll be exploited by the Conservative candidates, the One Nations candidates, and others in Queensland and so forth, Clive Palmer candidates. They will be able to argue that they are the Conservatives on climate change. Now, this is a big challenge for Scott Morrison, but what he's now trying to do overall, and by starting in the Hunter, he started at the hardest bit. What he wants to do now is talk about the economy. He doesn't want to mention Glasgow or Paris, for that matter, again. He wants to talk about Newcastle, he wants to talk about Gladstone, and he also wants to talk about jobs. Now, this is about making the economy the centre of his campaign. And to do that, and when you look at it, the challenge the Prime Minister faces is he has to gain a net 3 seats at the next election to win. That is to actually hold government. Now, that means he has to hold all the seats he has in Queensland and maybe pick up a seat, hold all the seats he has in New South Wales and maybe pick up a seat, preferably from Labor, but maybe also from an independent, and maybe pick up a seat in Tasmania from a Labor person. There's a chance he could pick up one in the Northern Territory, but that's always difficult to tell. So the election campaign is going to concentrate on the eastern seaboard. That's where most of these seats are, and that's where the government intends to concentrate its rural and regional campaign. And we saw today Anthony Albanese really plugging away at Scott Morrison's attempts to encourage people to vote for the Liberals or the Nationals in the Hunter. Because what Anthony Albanese is arguing, not that they won't be able to meet zero emissions by 2050, but that they won't keep their promises on local goods and jobs and so on. This is going to be a really local campaign. Anthony Albanese has already started to talk about failed promises during vaccine delivery. And this is where Gladys Berejiklian hasn't done Scott Morrison a great deal of favour in Western Sydney and in the Hunter Valley. And while she's popular in the eastern suburbs and the northern suburbs, her legacy in Western Sydney is toxic. We've seen federal Labor MP Ed Husick today delivering a powerful speech about the way that Western Sydney has been neglected by brand Liberal. We're going to see a lot of this in local seats, and it's going to be concentrated on the eastern seaboard, in part because Mark McGowan is going to keep Scott Morrison out of Western Australia for as long as possible.
I guess the issue too for the Prime Minister, just on WA, of course, Zach Kirkup took to the state election where they were annihilated beyond even opposition. I mean, the National Party is now in opposition, not the Liberal Party in the West. But they were annihilated because he took to the election and was smashed the very same environmental policy that Scott Morrison now has. Now, I can't see that's going to be a winner in the West. Not easy for Labor either, but it makes the PM's job of that hold position in Western Australia harder. And going back to the issue in the Hunter, of course, at that recent state New South Wales by-election, we had a 21% swing to One Nation. They're going to capitalise on that in the Hunter. Now, some of those votes won't go to Labor, sure, where the coalition, I think 6 months ago, would have thought they were in with a chance in Shortland and Patterson. I think that's more problematic, and the winners there will be minor parties, as you say, like One Nation. So it'll come down to how well they can sandbag along the east and maybe pick up some seats there in New South Wales. I have to say, the PM I know is going to Melbourne this week after New South Wales. I think Victoria is very hard. Despite the devastation of 2 years of the Andrews pandemic, of course, Victorians are still backing in the Premier over the Prime Minister, and that's the ground I think the Prime Minister is going to want to pick up. Go to this issue of the safeguard mechanism. It's a cap, a regulatory cap on companies that make significant emissions. It could be an opportunity for the Prime Minister. Let's have a listen to a bit of a fight that went on today about this particular issue.
Will you look at the safeguard mechanism to produce that?
There's no taxes in our plan, and there won't be.
There's a suite of measures that are available. There's the safeguards mechanism, which is where you're heading, I think, David, which is a government policy which they promised would reduce emissions.
So will you expand the safeguards mechanism?
Well, I'm not announcing safeguards policy on your show this morning, David. It's my melancholy duty to inform you.
I mean, the Labor Party is against the Kurri Kurri gas-fired power station. And now we hear they're going to legislate to tighten up the safeguard mechanism using heavy regulation to regulate away jobs here in the Hunter.
Now, I know it's a complex policy nuance, but already you could see with Angus Taylor and the Prime Minister, they're distilling it into basically a tax. So do you think that's an opportunity that the PM can smell today?
Well, I don't think there's any doubt about that, Peter. And let's remember, it was Tony Abbott who introduced the cap. It was Tony Abbott who succeeded in campaigning against getting rid of the carbon tax. And now it is Angus Taylor and Scott Morrison who are saying technology, not taxes. That is their mantra on climate change. In the Hunter, Scott Morrison is able to point to on-the-ground examples. And this is the problem that Labor has. It's not just the Kurri Kurri plant. It is other projects which Labor has opposed. And it's also funding from ARENA, which Labor continues to join the Greens in the Senate to oppose this funding. Now, these are things for projects which are green projects and which, in fact, Labor supports, but they are locked in with the Greens to oppose this. So this is where the stuff on the ground is going to count. Not so much the net zero by 2050, it's the stuff on the ground, the Kurri Kurri plant in the Hunter. These are the areas where the Prime Minister needs to get in, dig in on the existing protections of jobs, like the cap, and just point to Labor time and time again, as he is, saying everything they do is about a tax. Chris Bowen says, I don't want to talk about what our cap policy will be. That leaves the door open for Scott Morrison to say they want to reintroduce carbon taxes, and this is going to hurt Labor until they get their climate change policy out there in detail to be able to argue it. Until then, the government is going to go on a big scare campaign, which will have more effect, I think, than the net zero by 2050. It's so far off. When people talk about the Kurri Kurri plant, that's much more important than the net zero by 2050 target.
I'll ask you again just before we go quickly, Dennis, more chat today that there could be an early election this side of Christmas. I think it's Buckley's and none, but what do you think?
Absolute rubbish. There's no way that we can have that. It's just not physically possible. I think that as all along, the Prime Minister has been aiming to have an election next year. Of course, he's thought about it. ERC, the budget raiser gang, has been meeting regularly. It's getting ready to present a budget. The Prime Minister's already said the intent is to have a budget. So the key is you have a budget in April, and then you go straight to an election, and that election is in May. And this is when the economy will be rebounding. We know that in March, the beginning of March, that's when the government will get the December quarter, this huge boost to spending we're going to see over Christmas. That's when it will materialise at the beginning of March, when they're in the beginning, of the pre-budget and pre-election, real election campaign. So, no, I don't think there's any possibility of an election before Christmas.
I completely agree with you on the economic underpinning of those would-be election dates. You're spot on there, Dennis. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Peter.